Hello and welcome to TMI with Aldous Tyler for Friday, February 26th, 2021. Now, you may have heard via the media that last week we lost a giant of the broadcasting industry. And I'm not poking fun at the size he often had. I'm not exactly small myself. But we are talking about Rush Limbaugh. And not my favorite person in the world, probably not yours if you're a fan of my program. But I thought it was important that we not let this pass without fully recognizing the impact that Mr. Limbaugh had on not only the broadcasting industry, but the nation at large, and honestly, the world, considering the power position the United States is in. To do that well, I wanted to try to get closer to the source. I mean, I never met the man, but I was pretty sure I knew someone who, at the very least, came pretty close to, as close as I could say, to actually really knowing him. That would be friend of the program, Peter B. Collins from California. And Peter, welcome back to TMI.
Aldous, I always enjoy talking with you.
All right. Well, hopefully this won't be too unpleasant a conversation considering the subject matter. But if I'm right, you and Mr. Limbaugh actually share roughly the same length of time in broadcasting. He started like 71. You started 74, if I'm right.
Well, actually, I started in 73.
Okay.
And there are some similarities. Rush and I both started out as disc jockeys and transitioned into political talk show hosting. Like Rush, I didn't graduate from college. I attended, but the lure of working in radio was too great. Mm-hmm. And I crossed paths with him when I was the afternoon host at KNBR in San Francisco. I started there in 1989. And in the fall of 1990, we had a staff meeting, and they announced that the burgeoning syndicated Rush Limbaugh show would be added to this powerhouse station, 50,000 watts, in the arguably one of the most liberal cities in America, with all due respect to Madison.
Well, Madison and San Francisco probably, that's one of those things where I don't think there's any argument that San Francisco certainly has had the title longer.
Okay. So at this staff meeting, they played a tape, an air check of this guy that we'd never heard of. And this was a kind of stodgy old line station. The biggest audience we had was because we carried the baseball games of the San Francisco Giants. And to try to level out the seasonal nature of that, they decided to take a chance on Rush Limbaugh. So they played this tape, and it included one of Rush's really cruel homeless updates, where he would make fun of homeless people and essentially blame them for having served in Vietnam and suffering with PTSD, or having been marginalized as a person of color who never had educational or job opportunities. And it was an example of what Rush did in the sinister way that he conducted his program. He would target people who could not talk back. The show was structured to ensure that. And he would ridicule them for the entertainment of smug, mostly white, mostly male Americans across the country. So we cringed when we heard this. And of course, our opinions didn't matter. The decision had been made. And so Rush was added in Pacific time, 9 a.m. to noon. I followed him every day for several years. And it was a challenge because he, had the momentum. He also was promoted by the radio station with billboards and TV ads, and I was not. And so the one benefit was that because of the way the ratings day parts are structured, when his ratings went up, it made it look like my ratings went up. When you drill down to what we call the hour by hours, he had far more listeners than I did. And so I also had to deal with the phone calls that would follow from his show.
Oh, yes.
And the ditto heads would every day make fun of me, or, mostly I found they simply regurgitated what they had heard Rush say. And typically I'd let them say that. And I said, well, yeah, that's what Rush said, but do you have any thoughts of your own? and typically they would fumble, and I'd move on to the next caller.
They'd be like, well, we're not supposed to have those.
Yeah. So Aldous, it was September of 1991, Rush came to San Francisco, and KNBR did his show from there for a week. And as part of the promotion, I got a 1-hour interview with him. And I don't know, he probably did these on other stations across the country. At the time, he was about 2/3 of the way to the top. If you measure it by the number of stations, he had 400 when I interviewed him, and he peaked at about 600, maybe a little more.
For reference sake, that's a lot of stations.
It is, yes. Uh-huh. So last week, I dug out of my archives, which is a pile of reel-to-reel tapes in my garage, that 1991 interview, and I posted it at peterbcollins.com, edited out the commercials and all the other stuff, and just a sidelight, in AM talk radio at the time, the actual content of my show was 34 minutes in an hour.
Right.
So I got to talk to Rush for 34 minutes. And I encourage people to listen to the interview, because he did bring his act, but he was not nearly as pompous and self-aggrandizing. He admitted that many of his lines about talent on loan from God were just showbiz shtick. And most importantly, during the commercials, which again were almost half of the hour, so we spent as much time off air as we did on air, he conceded that it was an act. And the line I remember vividly from him was, "Peter, I'm going to ride this thing as far as I can." And then we turn the microphones back on, and he'd revert to his character.
I got to say, one thing that always struck me about it was, it seemed that, some people will say that people overall just don't change throughout their life, but that's generally not true. People will change, mature, et cetera, throughout their life. When you can tell someone is doing a character is when that person is dead on consistent for decades. And that's what always told me that Rush had some kind of act going on, because if you listen to any of his programming from the early 90s versus the stuff he was putting out just 2 or 3 years ago, same Rush. It's there was such consistency. Clearly that was a facade, but it's interesting that he was willing to admit it, so long as he wasn't, on the air admitting it.
The only thing that really changed over his 30 plus years was he dropped the pre-produced shtick, the homeless update, the kind of daily attacks on Jesse Jackson, and the feminazi reports. And he didn't use that kind of pre-planned shtick. He just had a stack of articles, and like Mort Saul, and like what I do, you go through them, you share information, and then you comment. So the reason, one of the things that I can add that I haven't seen in any of the post-death coverage of Rush Limbaugh is that he was cast for this part. And the brief history is that in the 1980s, the president of ABC Radio Networks, a guy named Ed McLaughlin, who had been a successful manager of talk radio stations in San Francisco and Los Angeles, he tried to launch a daytime talk network called ABC Talk Radio, and it failed. The spinoff, the one successful show from that lineup, was my former radio colleague, Dr. Dean Adele. We worked together at KGO way back in 1980. And he became a big sensation, made a lot of money, when McLaughlin left ABC and started his own company, EFM. But as part of the failed ABC Talk Radio project, ABC paid for extensive national market research. And they found a hole, an opening, an opportunity, which was awkwardly labeled non-guested confrontation talk radio.
Huh.
So you take that apart, no guests, it's just the host in a monologue, presenting himself as the voice of God, and it's confrontational. It's shock talk, it's hate talk. And so Ed McLaughlin went around the country trying to find the host who could fill that role. And he found Rush, who had been on the air at KFBK in Sacramento for 2 or 3 years. And he basically said, hey, do you want to play this part? Now, Rush presents it as he was discovered as this great, unpolished diamond.
Mm-hmm.
And that, he just flourished once he was given the opportunity.
Well, of course, that's the flattering way to put it.
Yeah. So that, I think, is an important thing for people to understand, because he certainly evolved and built the role out. And let me stipulate a couple of things. He was as skilled a broadcaster as I've known. He was very good at delivering a show, keeping it moving, pandering to the listener. We all do that.
Oh, yeah.
You're desperate, basically, to get somebody to tune in and then to get them to keep listening. The ratings reward two things: the number of people who tune in and what's called time spent listening. So that Rush had dedicated listeners who would listen to every minute of the show and then report to Arbitron, the rating service at the time, that they had listened to more than he actually broadcast. Really, I've seen the raw data that the ratings were based on. The other thing is that Rush not only spewed hate, he licensed it. He gave people permission to blurt out the ugly, hateful, racist, misogynist, unpopular ideas that lurked in their minds. And that really changed not only the radio industry and talk radio, but it changed political discourse in this country and ultimately created the model, that the toolbox that Donald Trump used to run for president, based on his mob rallies, on his appeal to the lowest of the lowest common denominator, and in particular, weaponizing white males with a grievance agenda and this whole parade that they are victims, that Trump is a victim. And it is the basis of successful propaganda operations throughout history.
True enough, although it's interesting because if you take that term that you used earlier, the non-guested confrontational term, that pretty much sums up Trump's rallies and Trump's speeches. He doesn't allow people to have a say back whenever possible. If they do try, get him out of here, kind of thing. But basically, he doesn't allow them to have a say back, and he is confrontational without allowing there to be any kind of a guest voice.
The other key component here was to reduce complicated things to simple black and white sound bites. And this was also enhanced by Frank Luntz, the pollster who worked with Newt Gingrich during the Republican takeover of the House in 1994. And they, really, at the time, they were sending out cassette tapes to Republican candidates for the House, and they recruited a whole new crop of people that populated the new majority. And they were all on message, calling the estate tax the death tax. And it also began the demonization of non-conservatives. Anybody to the left of the far right was seen, and particularly liberals, was characterized as un-American, as failures, as people who were not tough enough, who didn't believe in liberty and freedom. Instead, they believed in the nanny state and socialism, communism. Socialism always was tied to communism, even though there is no such thing extant in America today. There was a brief flirtation with communism after the Depression. But, the Communist Party is a fringe group. There is no widespread embrace of communist ideology, but Trump was using it in the 2020 campaign.
Oh, yeah. I mean, basically anybody who wasn't right there with him was pretty likely to have the word socialist or communist used against him, basically.
Well, and he tied it to Antifa, and basically that was used to, mischaracterize the entire Black Lives Matter movement.
Mm-hmm.
And so you see this, and let me just challenge your viewers and listeners to summon a single idea that Trump talked about for a possible second term. He had a zero agenda. It was simply pounding Joe Biden as Sleepy Joe, and he's tied to Bernie Sanders and AOC. And I wish that were the case, but there was not a shred of truth to it.
No, not at all. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are talking to Peter B. Collins. And just to be clear about this, while Peter technically retired sometime in late November, you can still catch commentary from Peter at peterbcollins.com, as events are sometimes just far too interesting for him to let lay. So he will go ahead and gift us with, frankly, insights that I have trouble finding anywhere else, which is why I always keep a sharp eye on what Peter's talking about. Now, Peter, going back to Limbaugh in particular, I have to agree. We're talking about one of the most skilled broadcasters in recent memory. But the problem is that he didn't have the moral compass needed to see that, sure, this is great for him. It paid him tremendous dividends, but he was using his powers of ridicule, his ability to keep a show snappy and all that, and just didn't seem to care who he was trotting on to get there.
Well, there's a term for this, and I didn't develop it. I want to credit a professor whose name I can't summon from a university in Canada that I can't remember. But after the Charlie Hebdo massacre over the the cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad,
mm-hmm.
I did an interview with him, and he said that the important thing to note is that there are two ways to conduct satire. One is to punch upward at authority, at power, at money, at class, and the other is to punch downward. Rush always punched downward, and he aligned himself with the power centers of the far-right Republican minority that enjoyed majority rule by manipulating the system. And of course, his short-lived TV show was produced by Roger Ailes. Roger Ailes took that experience, went to Rupert Murdoch, got oodles of money, and that led to Fox News. Fox News, again, took the pitting of conservative against the rest of America, ridiculing it and always mischaracterizing it, and producing it in an entertaining fashion. I remember Robert Greenwald, the documentary filmmaker, did a piece called Outfoxed, a documentary. And one of the things he showed was that the B-roll, the video that they use to distract the viewer when the anchor is just reading a story, the B-roll on Fox News was heavily loaded with scantily clad women, pole dancers, strippers, women with large breasts who were letting them pour out of their tops. And of course, Roger Ailes shows the legs of his women anchors. Many of them are blonde beauties, in some cases a former beauty queen. And so this packaging of far right ideology with very attractive, seductive imagery and the whooshes. One of the things people probably aren't aware of, but if you listen to Fox on satellite radio, the subwoofer roars at every whoosh that is played. That is a subliminal trigger to signal the viewer to pay attention because some new bull is coming on.
Well, I mean, it's one of those things where basically, so what you're telling me then is that what Rush Limbaugh started, which was his very slick, very well produced, but audio content where he was again no guests, but confrontational. They took that and then they added all of the visual and some more audio tricks to really hone it in.
Yes, and let me be candid because I've talked on a previous podcast or video show with you about the techniques that are used at MSNBC.
Mm-hmm.
And it is similar, that you don't bring on a guest who is critical of the narrative you're promoting. So Rachel Maddow went overboard selling us on Russiagate, and nobody, Glenn Greenwald, Aaron Mate, it's a minor part. I was available and she never called. But for example, Bill Binney, the very talented former technical director at the National Security Agency, who was an early critic of the Russiagate narrative, she only mentioned him on one show, and she didn't invite him on to explain why he could prove that Russia or anybody else externally did not hack DNC servers. We now know that's a fact because Sean Henry, the former FBI agent who ran CrowdStrike, which was hired by the DNC to provide validation of the claim that Russia had hacked their servers, he was forced to admit under questioning from Adam Schiff under oath, we could never prove that any data was exfiltrated by anybody from the DNC servers.
Yep.
So these tactics were deftly employed by the right, but I encourage your audience to be critical of the news they consume that is, aimed at the left, at Democrats, because they use the same tactics.
Oh, yeah. Well, and while I, for example, try to make sure my presentation has some polish to it, I don't go in for the gimmicks. I want to make sure that the information is there and solid and reputable on its own. So, but yeah, it's definitely one of those things where if you're not careful, there are these various things. And again, subliminal things, like you said, the massive bass to the whooshes and things like that are there that are designed to catch you right in the back of that brain where you're not paying attention and make something stick that maybe you shouldn't have in there. I mean, when you're given a piece of information that is patently false and it's preceded by that, you're more likely to remember it. Even if you remember it and think it's ridiculous, it's still going to stick.
Yeah.
So, Peter, with all that in mind, then, how did you feel when he got the Presidential Medal of Freedom?
It was a gimmick. One of the things is on Facebook and in other social media and just in public expression, many people have taken pleasure in dancing on Rush Limbaugh's death. And I don't blame them because he did it to other people in a merciless and crude, tasteless way. I just don't do that. I believe it's better to honestly evaluate the damage that he did rather than reduce myself to name calling and trading hate against a dead man. So again, I'm not critical of people who have taken that moment to express themselves in that way. I just don't do it.
Oh, I understand. And I can tell you that I've somewhat tongue-in-cheek said that, when somebody said, well, how would you like it if when you died, a whole bunch of conservatives cheered and, pretty much held a party? I'm like, Well, if that were to happen, I think I would have been much more wildly successful than than my dreams could make me. Basically, it's one of those things where it's like, the fact is that um, if I were to offend people whose overall worldview involves placing themselves above others, not recognizing the common humanity amongst all of us, and trying their darndest to make sure that profit rules over everyone getting their basic needs met. If I'm offending people so much that do that they're going to party when I die, then apparently I've lived a life worth living. Is the way I see it. But
well, Aldous, before the clock runs out, I'd like to make one more point.
Sure.
And that is to call out the enablers of Rush Limbaugh's whole shtick and his success. And that is the management of radio stations across the country. And I want to point out that you started the grassroots support group Nonstop Radio to support the failed effort to bring liberal voices into talk radio during the Bush administration.
Yep.
And it's important to know, and I've used this phrase intentionally, that programmers and managers who chose to put his show on, who turned a blind ear to the lies and the hate that he was spewing on a daily basis because it revived the revenues and profits of AM radio, which were in sharp decline, they used the same mindset as pornographers. And yet they can look at themselves and, consider themselves successful business people. And there are a few women in programming who were very supportive of Rush Limbaugh. And they, too, didn't care about the impact of his misogyny and the dramatic shift, because their ratings were up, they were getting bonuses, and it was all just part of the circus. Well, this had a really dire impact on the United States, and we will not recover. Limbaugh will not be replaced. Sure, they'll put a new host on that show, but the levels that he reached, the impact that he had, will not be matched. Podcasting and other, cable news have displaced talk radio in many respects. But the model that he, was cast into and that he exploited will continue. And we saw it culminate on January 6th at the U.S. Capitol.
We sure did. And personally, for me, anytime I hear about, for example, a Black person either dying or at the very least being hurt at the hands of police with little to no cause, I can look into my heart and go, you know what? That's one that I can probably blame on Rush, because that officer probably got raised on him.
Well, yeah. I mean, the whole embrace of authority, the abuse of people who stood up for their rights, who fought back when the rights of others were violated. And of course, the studies have shown that in the summer of 2020, only about 6% of the public demonstrations involved looting or serious violence. Most of the violence was provoked by police. And yet, Trump can look at Portland and Seattle and talk about liberal Democrat mayors and law and order. And of course, that's the big lie, because Trump openly tried to violate the law to hold on to his presidency.
Absolutely.
And that kind of law breaking and corruption is rationalized by his followers because they see it as serving a higher cause. But any objective, particularly somebody who came in from another country who looked at this would say, well, wait a minute, Donald Trump is not a law and order president.
Yeah, no, it's from any point of view outside of Donald Trump's own, shall we say, pre-selected point of view, would definitely see that this was not anything even remotely orderly. So, Peter, I appreciate so much you coming on today. Again, ladies and gentlemen, this is Peter B. Collins, the one, the only inimitable voice of the Bay Area. And if you want to keep up with him, which I encourage you to do, check out peterbcollins.com. He may not be doing the daily work anymore, but he still will come on and let you know what's going on from the view of Peter B. Collins, if it seems to be good enough to drag him out of his retirement. And Peter, thank you so much for the fact that even though you want to retire, you still will gift us with these insights when it's necessary.
Thank you, Aldous. Great to be with you today.
You're welcome. You've been watching and listening to TMI with Aldous Tyler. We'll be right back.